Nate Smith Show. Before I get on out of here, I had to talk about a story that's very, very important. And albeit indirectly, it involves Caitlin Clark.
Everybody assumed that letting Christy Sides go was the ultimate solution for the Indiana Fever. But they may have just stepped straight into a completely different kind of disaster. The moment the news dropped that the front office had finally decided to pull the trigger on the previous coaching staff, social media absolutely erupted with pure celebration. Fans had spent an entire season screaming at their televisions demanding a leadership overhaul after watching a once-in-a-generation talent get buried inside a suffocating, outdated offensive scheme. The announcement of Stephanie White coming in to take over was immediately celebrated as the most perfectly scripted homecoming imaginable. She was born and raised in Indiana, had suited up for the Fever herself, had coached at a championship level, and genuinely understood the enormous weight of expectations sitting on this franchise. It felt like a storybook resolution to an incredibly stormy rookie season, with major media outlets instantly declaring the Fever the team to watch heading into next year. But while everybody was busy popping champagne over this so-called flawless decision, one of the most powerful voices in all of sports media stepped forward and completely flipped the narrative. Stephen A. Smith does not sugarcoat anything. And the moment he directed his full attention toward the Indiana Fever's new locker room reality, he detonated a truth bomb so massive it instantly reframed how the entire sports world was looking at this situation. In his view, bringing in Stephanie White is not the miracle remedy the front office is convinced it is, and the deep-seated issues surrounding Caitlin Clark run far too complicated for a simple change behind the bench to resolve. He exposed a massive unspoken tension simmering just underneath the surface of this brand-new partnership. He pointed out that managing the single biggest superstar on the entire planet carries a dark and uncomfortable side that nobody on television is willing to honestly address. And what he laid out next sent absolute shockwaves rippling straight through the entire WNBA universe. To truly grasp the enormous minefield that Stephanie White is now walking directly into, you have to revisit the sheer, unrelenting chaos that swallowed the Indiana Fever whole over the past 12 months. Christy Sides wasn't dismissed simply because the team lost basketball games. She was removed because she completely failed to adapt to the unprecedented phenomenon that had been dropped without warning into her hands. From the opening tip of the very first game, it was painfully obvious to every single person watching that the entire league had a gigantic target painted directly on Caitlin's back. Veteran players were outrageously physical, throwing cheap shots, hip-checking her across the court, and doing everything possible to mentally and physically break the rookie at every opportunity. Fans and analysts sat in stunned disbelief as the Fever's coaching staff stood completely frozen on the sideline, refusing to demand technical fouls or publicly stand up for their franchise player. Stephen A. Smith was visibly furious on national television, repeatedly hammering the franchise for failing to protect the most valuable asset in women's basketball. He argued relentlessly that the locker room had zero enforcer presence and that the previous coach was far too frightened to disrupt the deeply embedded old guard mentality of the WNBA in order to properly defend a new-era superstar. The environment deteriorated so rapidly and so completely that rumors began circulating about serious fractures running through the core of the team itself. Certain players were noticeably uncomfortable with the lopsided media spotlight, which led to visibly awkward post-game press conferences and completely broken chemistry on the basketball court. The front office recognized they had a severe culture crisis on their hands, and they desperately needed someone carrying real authority and genuine credibility to come in and repair the damage. But importing a highly respected and battle-tested coach to bring discipline back to a fractured roster was only going to solve part of the problem. The truly explosive controversy surrounding this new hire comes directly from where Stephanie White was standing just weeks before she accepted this job. She didn't arrive from some obscure, irrelevant program. She was the architect and mastermind behind the Connecticut Sun, the very franchise that had just ruthlessly knocked the Indiana Fever out of the playoffs. And that playoff matchup was absolutely nothing resembling a clean or sportsmanlike series. The Sun played an intensely aggressive, brutally physical brand of defense that constantly tested the outermost boundaries of the rulebook. It was during that specific series that Dawana Carrington infamously poked Caitlin directly in the eye, a wildly controversial incident that set the internet ablaze and ignited enormous debates about the state of officiating across the entire league. Through every single moment of that physical, contentious series, Stephanie White was the one stalking the sideline, commanding her players to bring suffocating, relentless defensive pressure against the rookie phenom. She publicly defended her team's aggressive identity, casually dismissing every complaint about dirty play as nothing more than standard playoff competitiveness. Now, in one of the most surreal and ironic twists the sport has ever produced, she is being paid a full salary to protect the very same player her former team had just spent an entire series physically punishing. Stephen A. Smith immediately zeroed in on this jaw-dropping irony, highlighting the enormous psychological obstacle this reality creates inside that locker room. How exactly does a brand new coach walk through the door on day one and genuinely look Caitlin Clark in the eye after personally designing the exact defensive blueprint that left her beaten and battered on national television? Building authentic trust with a superstar who just spent an entire playoff series watching you defend her biggest tormentors is an extraordinarily steep mountain to climb, and it demands a level of relationship building that goes so far beyond simply drawing plays up on a whiteboard. But the deeply uncomfortable shared history between the new coach and the franchise player wasn't even close to the most alarming element buried inside this story. When Stephen A. Smith took to his platform to fully dissect this monumental coaching change, he delivered the most brutally honest assessment of the WNBA's cultural reality that anyone has dared to put on record. He spent the entire previous season methodically exposing the quiet jealousy and deeply rooted resentment that veteran players and established coaches carry toward the explosive new wave of attention flooding into the sport. According to his well-connected and deeply plugged-in sources, coaching this particular team at this specific moment in time is unquestionably the most dangerous job anywhere in professional sports. He exposed the brutal and uncomfortable reality that Stephanie White has voluntarily stepped into a completely unwinnable media situation. If the Indiana Fever come storming out next season and completely dominate the competition, locking up a top playoff position and making a legitimate championship run, not a single person is going to line up to hand the head coach the credit. Every single headline will exclusively shower praise on Caitlin's legendary playmaking, her impossible logo threes, and her breathtaking ability to lift a struggling franchise back into relevance. But if the team stumbles badly out of the gate, if the chemistry remains completely shattered, or if they suffer another embarrassing early elimination, the entire sports world will instantly point every finger directly at Stephanie White. The media will ruthlessly accuse her of squandering a generational talent, loudly claiming she couldn't figure out how to properly unlock the greatest offensive weapon the sport has ever been lucky enough to witness. It is an impossibly razor-thin tightrope walk being performed over a bottomless pit with absolutely no safety net underneath her. Stephen A. Smith passionately argued that a veteran coach of White's undeniable caliber, someone who has already captured Coach of the Year honors and cemented a substantial professional legacy, is placing her entire life's work and hard-earned reputation directly on the line by accepting this uniquely radioactive assignment. Simply managing the relentless media circus that surrounds this one specific roster is itself a full-time occupation that constantly threatens to completely overshadow the actual game of basketball being played on the court. And what unfolds when the massive, unchecked egos trapped inside that building begin violently colliding with the overwhelming outside pressure would genuinely shock every single person paying attention. The locker room that Stephanie White is inheriting is absolutely nothing close to a unified and cohesive front, and the internal dynamics currently festering beneath the surface represent a ticking time bomb waiting for the right moment to detonate. All throughout the previous season, the simmering underlying tension between the franchise's key foundational pieces was uncomfortably visible and undeniable. NaLyssa Smith spent a significant stretch of the year visibly disengaged, posting cryptic and pointed messages across social media and appearing completely checked out from the rest of the squad during the moments that mattered most. She clearly felt pushed to the margins by the offensive structure and by the blinding, all-consuming spotlight being aimed solely at the rookie guard. Meanwhile, Kelsey Mitchell, the extraordinarily talented veteran scorer who genuinely kept the entire operation from completely falling apart during their darkest and most desperate stretches, is now walking into one of the most complicated free agency decisions of her professional career. She has to seriously weigh whether she wants to return to an environment where she will forever be treated as the second option in the eyes of the media, no matter how many points she puts on the scoreboard on any given night. Stephen A. Smith pointed out with absolute clarity that a head coach's primary and most critical responsibility in this exact scenario has absolutely nothing to do with drawing up pick-and-roll combinations. It is strictly and entirely about ego management. White has to somehow convince a locker room full of highly accomplished, fiercely competitive professional athletes to willingly sacrifice their own individual glory and personal milestones to serve the larger narrative being written around the franchise's marquee superstar. In a league where major shoe deals, lucrative endorsement opportunities, and national television exposure remain incredibly scarce commodities, asking proven veteran players to voluntarily step back into the shadows is an extraordinarily dangerous and volatile gamble. If White leans too heavily in favor of the veterans, she immediately risks alienating her superstar player and inviting the full, unrestrained fury of millions of intensely devoted fans. If she caters exclusively and completely to the rookie, she risks systematically destroying whatever locker room respect she walked in with, potentially igniting a quiet mutiny that would instantly and permanently obliterate any realistic championship aspirations. But carefully navigating the emotional minefield buried within that roster was only the surface layer compared to the far deeper and more destructive clash in basketball philosophy that is actively brewing behind the scenes. There exists a fundamental and potentially irreconcilable difference between how Stephanie White philosophically views and approaches the game of basketball and how her brand new franchise cornerstone naturally and instinctively operates on the court. Throughout her remarkably successful coaching career, White has constructed her entire professional foundation on highly structured, defensive-minded, methodical half-court execution. She demands unwavering discipline at every single moment, preferring a gritty, grinding style of play that leans heavily on physical interior dominance and relentlessly exhausting defensive rotations. It is old-school, traditional, punch-you-directly-in-the-mouth WNBA basketball performed at its absolute highest and most unforgiving level. However, that happens to be the complete and total opposite of the chaotic, breathlessly fast-paced, wildly improvisational brand of magic that transformed the Iowa Phenom into a household name recognized all across the globe. Caitlin thrives in a completely unscripted and unpredictable environment, pulling up confidently for heavily contested transition threes launched from well beyond the logo, firing off outrageously risky no-look passes through seemingly impossible traffic, and operating at a completely frantic and relentless pace that systematically breaks down and exhausts every opposing defense it encounters. Stephen A. Smith passionately and repeatedly hammered this massive stylistic contradiction, sounding a loud and urgent warning that forcing this particular player into a rigid and traditional system would be nothing short of a catastrophic and irreversible mistake. The evidence was already sitting right there on the tape for everyone to examine. We already witnessed firsthand exactly what happened when the previous coaching regime attempted to place a heavy leash around her creativity during the early portion of the rookie season. The offense turned visibly and painfully stagnant. The turnovers began piling up at an alarming rate, and the team subsequently endured a deeply embarrassing string of completely preventable losses. The single most pressing and consequential challenge facing Stephanie White at this very moment is honestly determining whether she is genuinely willing to completely dismantle and walk away from her deeply ingrained coaching philosophy in order to fully accommodate a singular, irreplaceable talent. Can a lifelong old-school disciplinarian truly and unconditionally hand over the keys of the entire franchise to a run-and-gun rookie without instinctively and repeatedly slamming on the brakes at the worst possible moments? If she attempts to pull the offense back and force the team into playing traditional, half-court basketball, the resulting friction and visible tension between the bench and the point guard will be unmistakably obvious and deeply uncomfortable for every single person tuning in to watch. But the mounting challenges on the court are made dramatically worse and significantly more complicated by the intense and unrelenting demands flowing down directly from the front office. The pressure originating from the executive suite has reached a full and complete boiling point, and the expectations being loaded onto this freshly assembled coaching staff have crossed the line into borderline unreasonable territory. The Indiana Fever recently welcomed back Kelly Krauskopf, a legendary and deeply respected executive who previously constructed this very franchise into a sustained and dominant perennial powerhouse. Her return to the organization sent an unmistakably loud and clear signal about a massive and fundamental shift in the entire philosophical direction of the franchise. The slow and painful rebuilding phase is completely and permanently finished, and the era of graciously accepting moral victories and celebrating small developmental wins has officially and conclusively come to an end. They did not go out and hire a high-profile, expensive, battle-tested veteran coach simply to patiently nurture young talent through a gradual 4-year development process. The organizational mandate could not possibly be any clearer or more unambiguous. They fully and unequivocally expect to be legitimate, credible championship contenders starting immediately and without any grace period whatsoever. Stephen A. Smith revealed with striking candor that this aggressively compressed and unforgiving timeline places a profoundly unfair and deeply unreasonable burden squarely on the shoulders of everyone involved. The front office fully understands and openly acknowledges that they are operating within an extremely narrow and rapidly closing window to fully capitalize on the absolutely unprecedented financial explosion this team is currently experiencing. Every single home game is completely sold out without exception. Merchandise is flying off the shelves at a pace that has absolutely no historical comparison anywhere in the sport, and the entire league's television ratings and broadcast future are almost entirely dependent on the continued success and sustained relevance of this one specific franchise. If the team begins losing consistently and the product on the court starts to deteriorate, the enormous wave of newly converted casual fans could evaporate almost overnight, dealing a direct and devastating blow to the franchise's financial foundation and long-term stability. This stark and uncomfortable reality means that Stephanie White is stepping onto that sideline operating with absolutely zero margin for error and no safety net of any kind position beneath her. She does not have the luxury of using the opening weeks of the regular season to casually experiment with lineup combinations or organically and gradually build team chemistry over time. She is being fully expected to walk directly into training camp, instantaneously repair a deeply fractured and emotionally damaged locker room, architect a completely flawless offensive system that authentically maximizes the unique and irreplaceable talent at her disposal, and begin systematically dismantling the elite top-tier teams across the league from virtually the opening night. It is an intensely pressurized, suffocating environment that has completely broken far more experienced and deeply decorated coaches throughout the long history of professional basketball, and the brutal and unvarnished reality of what actually happens behind those closed facility doors when the television cameras stop rolling paints an extraordinarily concerning and deeply troubling picture for everyone involved. As the off-season continues to quietly and slowly unfold, the complete organizational silence surrounding their specific and detailed plans for roster construction this summer has become absolutely and thunderously deafening. Everyone watching closely understands that in order to genuinely and effectively protect their massive financial and competitive investment, this team desperately and urgently needs to go out and sign a legitimate enforcer. A highly aggressive, deeply intimidating, battle-hardened veteran presence who will make every single opposing player seriously reconsider their decision before throwing another cheap shot anywhere near their franchise point guard. Stephen A. Smith has been screaming this exact and specific point passionately into a live microphone for nearly 8 consecutive months without any meaningful response. He hammered and repeatedly criticized the current roster construction for being fundamentally and dangerously too soft, noting with visible frustration that watching their transcendent superstar constantly get knocked violently to the hardwood floor without any immediate and forceful retaliation is a completely unacceptable and frankly embarrassing way to operate and manage a professional basketball franchise at the highest level. Stephanie White now carries the enormous and weighty responsibility of personally identifying and actively recruiting the specific types of players who are genuinely and wholeheartedly willing to handle the brutal and unglamorous dirty work, absorbing the punishing physical punishment so that the creative playmakers can freely and safely operate without constantly looking over their shoulders. But successfully locating and landing those very specific types of players is an extraordinarily difficult and complicated undertaking, particularly given the deep and persistent quiet resentment that continues to thoroughly permeate throughout the veteran circles scattered across the entire league. Convincing a tough, proud, and established veteran player to willingly relocate to Indiana for the specific and clearly defined purpose of serving as a physical guardian and protector for a far younger and infinitely more famous and celebrated teammate demands a truly masterful and extraordinary level of personal persuasion and organizational salesmanship. If the front office completely and inexcusably fails to surgically address this glaring and dangerous roster deficiency before free agency closes, they will be sending their brand new head coach marching directly into a fully armed and hostile battlefield equipped with nothing more useful than a water pistol. The systematic physical abuse will completely and immediately resume the moment the opening night tip-off goes into the air. The injuries will inevitably begin accumulating at an unsustainable rate, and the deeply exhausting and incredibly damaging cycle of constant media outrage and public controversy will restart itself all over again from the very beginning. Stephen A. Smith's ultimate and most powerful warning was never simply a pointed critique aimed at evaluating a single coaching hire in isolation. It was a deeply chilling and sobering prediction about the genuinely fragile and precarious state of an entire storied franchise teetering right on the absolute razor's edge between either achieving historic and transformational greatness or suffering a total and utterly catastrophic collapse. When everything is stripped away and examined with complete and brutal honesty, the Indiana Fever have pushed every single chip they possess to the center of the table on one enormous, enormously risky gamble that carries the very real potential to entirely and permanently reshape the future landscape of women's professional basketball. Stephanie White arrives carrying a deeply impressive and thoroughly earned resume, an undeniable and razor-sharp basketball intelligence, and a fierce and burning competitive fire that this particular team has been desperately missing and urgently crying out for. But as Stephen A. Smith so powerfully and brilliantly exposed for the entire world to examine, coaching this specific roster at this specific moment in history is no longer simply or primarily about the sport of basketball itself. It is about successfully navigating an extraordinarily complex, deeply tangled, and constantly shifting web of massive competing egos, suffocating and relentless media scrutiny, genuinely dangerous league-wide resentment and jealousy, and entirely unrealistic and unforgiving organizational expectations that would test the absolute limits of even the greatest coaches this profession has ever produced. The true and defining test of this partnership will never be drawn up neatly on a clipboard during a critical and high-pressure late-game timeout. It will happen behind tightly sealed and heavily guarded closed doors during the inevitable and unforgiving moments when real adversity finally comes crashing down without mercy. When the first significant and demoralizing losing streak arrives uninvited, when the media begins loudly and relentlessly questioning every single offensive decision being made, and when the brutal and cumulative physical toll of an unforgiving professional season begins steadily wearing every single person in that building completely down to the bone, the entire sports world will finally and definitively discover whether this highly celebrated and enormously hyped partnership can genuinely survive and emerge stronger from the consuming flames. Will this supremely experienced and battle-tested veteran coach successfully and permanently bridge the enormous and historically significant gap separating the gritty, grinding, traditional old guard of the WNBA from the electrifying, flashy, and breathtakingly fast-paced new era of superstar-driven basketball? Or will the suffocating and relentless pressure, the deeply entrenched jealousies and personal resentments, and the sheer overwhelming and unprecedented magnitude of the spotlight ultimately prove to be far too powerful and all-consuming, completely and irreparably tearing this team apart from deep within its own walls? As the entire sports world collectively holds its breath in nervous and excited anticipation, waiting for the opening tip-off to finally arrive, one single truth stands completely beyond any reasonable question or doubt. The greatest, most compelling, and most unpredictable reality show in all of modern professional sports is preparing to make its dramatic return, and the stakes surrounding every single moment of what comes next have genuinely and literally never been higher in the entire history of this game.